My parents' house is located in the rural outskirts of town. The property is a couple acres, and the house itself is fairly large as well. My room is on the side of the house and has its own screened-in porch that I used to share with my sister when she still lived at home, but now it's just me. There's no lock on the screen door, and I usually keep my porch door open for airflow in the cooler months. Whenever my friends who lived in the city or the suburbs came over, they would get on my case about this and tell me how unsafe it was for a girl to sleep in a room that wasn't completely locked off from the outside. I always brushed it off since I live so deep in the woods that it's basically unheard of for someone to simply walk onto a property that isn't theirs. Plus, my parents' property is gated, so it wasn't like anyone could drive a van up to the house. However, at a certain point, I started to feel like things were being rearranged on the porch when I wasn't using it. It was totally minor things, like the beanbag was shifted a little bit to the other side, or one of the drawers had been cracked open. I truly didn't think much of it, despite feeling a bit concerned though. I mostly used the porch to smoke to keep the smell out of the house, so I thought maybe I was smoking a little bit too much and forgetting some of the stuff I was doing, which was definitely possible. That and sometimes my parents, specifically my mom, would come around and rearrange things without telling me. I figured this had to be the case, so I politely asked my mom if she had been on my porch recently and moved anything around. But she said no, that she hadn't, and that she hadn't stepped foot on my porch or in my room in over a week. This was initially a bit frightening to me, but then I remembered that sometimes my mom flat out forgets half the stuff she does, just like me. And I also had the suspicion that she was actually lying because she had found an ashtray or something and didn't want to confront what I was doing out there. I still asked my dad too, just to be sure, but he laughed it off, saying there wasn't a chance in the world that he would want to even take a peek at his teenage daughter's stuff. With a somewhat unanswered question, but a little brevity to balance it out, I decided that it wasn't anything to be worried about. A few days later, my mom and dad told me they were going out of town for the weekend. They both work in the same industry, and there was some kind of big sales convention happening in the neighboring state, so they would stay in a hotel for a couple nights, then come back on Sunday. They let me have free reign of the house and said I could have friends over as long as everything was cleaned up afterward and nothing got broken. Of course, as soon as they were gone, I threw a party and I trashed the house, telling myself I'd clean everything in the morning. However, that night, after everyone went home, I couldn't get to sleep. I don't know if it was anxiety about cleaning up the next day or if it was intuition, but I lied awake in bed for over 2 hours and I couldn't catch a wink. At this point, I figured if I went out to the porch and smoked a bunch of bowls, that I could force myself to pass out. I grabbed my bong from its hiding spot and filled it up with some water. Then I walked out to the porch, except for when I got to the doorway, I froze. Couldn't even see anything in the moment. I just knew something was wrong. A chill ran down my spine as I hyper-focused on the arrangement of things on the porch. The beanbag had moved a few inches, but more than that, it looked like there was a pile of blankets on it that hadn't been there a few hours ago. I looked closer and realized in terror that it was actually a person lying on it. I gasped loudly enough to alert the person of my presence, and in that moment, their eyes opened. In the darkness, I saw the whites of their eyes look right at me. I screamed and dropped my bong on the ground, shattering it. Then I slammed the porch door shut and locked it. For a few seconds, I was petrified and I couldn't move. So through the blinds, I watched this person get up and quickly flee from the porch, out of the screen door. As soon as they were out of sight, I rushed to lock every entrance to my bedroom, and then I called the cops. They came almost an hour later, but by then, the person was long gone, and all the cops did was look at me like I was cracked out or hysterical. They basically pretended to take my statement, then they left and never followed up. At this point, it was obvious that I definitely wouldn't be able to sleep, so I stayed up in the living room with all the lights on until the sun came up. Then after I cleaned all the messes around the house, I called my parents and told them what happened. Ever since then, I've kept a padlock on the inside of my screen door so I can keep the airflow in my room without having to worry about intruders. Thankfully, I'm sure that person was just homeless and looking for a place to sleep. But it still creeps me out to know that they were sleeping less than 20 feet away from me without even a closed door to separate us, for who knows how many nights before I saw them. If they had been a worse person, or have been more tempted over time to do something horrible, things could have been much worse. My dad was a pretty stereotypical boomer on the surface. He had a mediocre marriage with my mother, and he loved to hide away in his man cave in the basement. During football season, he'd have his buddies over to drink beer and yell at the big flat screen TV mounted on the wall. Other than that, he worked a 9 to 5 and often stayed late and left early for work, either to get more done or to spend more time away from home. On the weekdays, I barely ever saw him. When we got home, I'd get stuck in homework or video games, and he'd get sucked into his television, whether it was on cable or part of his collection of vintage tapes and DVDs. During the weekends, though, we occasionally had time together to bond. When I was a teenager, we started to watch movies together out of his catalog. I enjoyed the new tradition, but even in the beginning, I was old enough to notice that some things were a bit off about the setup. My dad kept all the DVDs displayed on the shelves right by the TV, but the tapes were a different story. There was a small closet door in the man cave, which I was expressly ordered to never go into, as it housed some of my dad's most prized and private possessions, and that maybe one day when I was older, he'd let me see what was inside. All I knew was that there was a boatload of VHS tapes in there. My dad would usually ask me to describe the kind of movie I wanted to see, like who was in it, or if it was a Western movie or whatever. And then after he asked me a number of questions, he'd always say, "Oh yeah, I've got the right movie for you, son." But more often than not, he would dip inside his private storage room and he'd be gone for several minutes, then return with some R-rated cult classic VHS tape from the 80s or 90s. My dad never held back on the content he exposed me to in these movies, and unsurprisingly, my mother was never present for these movie nights. In fact, anytime she had to poke her head in to mention something to me or my dad, there was usually a disturbing look on her face that I could never understand. Despite her apparent discomfort, I grew attached to this routine with my dad. But as the months and years went by, my curiosity about what was behind that door only grew. My leading theory was that he had some kind of legitimate stockpile of collectibles amassed in there, like a huge investment he was just sitting on while the value grew, waiting for the right moment to sell it off. But I was always too scared to take a peek though, and with my dad spending almost all of his free time down there, I didn't have any openings to sneak in. Then, one day, my opportunity finally arrived. An old friend of my mom and dad's, named Victoria, passed away unexpectedly, and they needed to go to her funeral, which meant they would be gone for the better part of an entire day. They let me stay at home because I never knew Victoria, and right away, I knew this was my chance. I would finally be home alone for long enough to look inside. I waited for them to be gone for almost an hour to make sure they didn't turn back for any reason. Then I crept into the basement with my heart pounding as I walked up to the door and entered the secret room at long last. Immediately, I was shocked by how big it was. I'd always imagined a tiny linen closet, but it was actually a big enough room to squeeze in a king mattress if only you could fit it through the door. I pulled the chain on the incandescent light bulb hanging from the ceiling and illuminated the highly secretive stockpile. Initially, I was pretty disappointed. All I saw were a couple of shelves with high school and college memorabilia, a few collectibles, a record collection, and some old cameras, and even an unplugged chest freezer with a bunch of crates full of VHS tapes stacked on top of it. However, I figured if there was something really good that I'd have to go digging for it, so I moved the VHS crates off the freezer and opened it up. Funnily enough, despite growing up with unrestricted internet access, my stomach did a flip when I saw what was piled up in the chest. There was an absolute truckload of Playboy magazines. I laughed at the thought of my dad not being so different to me as a young man. Then I started to dig through the Playboys for a little while. I wanted to find the real vintage issues, the super old ones, which I figured would be at the bottom. So I unloaded them all out onto the floor so I could see what was underneath. And that's when I made the real discovery, the one I wish I'd never made. There were 4 ammo boxes neatly stowed at the bottom, and each of them were labeled. One said miscellaneous, another said memories with Anthony, and the third said memories with Bob and Melissa. And the last one read memories with Victoria. A million questions ran through my head by then, but the biggest among them were, why do these memories need to be kept secret so seriously? And what sort of family friend was Victoria that her memories ended up under lock and a key? Torn between staying ignorant and satisfying my curiosity after so long, I finally decided I needed to know who Victoria really was and why my parents needed to go to her funeral, despite me never meeting her. I opened the ammo box and found that it was full of VHS tapes, all labeled with dates and nothing else. I picked one at random that was from at least 20 years ago. Then I took it out to the den to play it on the VCR. Within seconds, I was mortified, but incapable of doing myself the basic decency of ejecting the tape right then and there. On the screen, I saw a dimly lit bedroom. On a chair in the corner, I saw my mother from 20 years ago, naked and tied up, completely immobilized and gagged. She was crying. On the bed, I saw my dad and a woman I didn't recognize, presumably Victoria, kissing my dad right in front of my mother. Tears welled in my eyes and began streaming down my face as my father began engaging in acts with this strange woman that I could not possibly utter even in writing, even after keeping silent about it for so long. Before I saw any more than I could stomach, I rushed to eject the tape. Then I returned all of my dad's possessions to the exact place in which I found them, and I closed the door to that room and never dared to open it again. I never said anything to either of them, but I became emotionally distant and I started spending as much time away from both of them as I could. I just couldn't look at either of them the same way, especially my father. The sickness it must take to do that to someone you love is something I hope, beyond hope, that I did not inherit from him. I'm sure my parents somehow noticed that I discovered something about their past, given the timing of everything. They never tried to reconcile. To this day, I cannot erase the memory of what I witnessed in that file tape. When I was 13, I was home alone for several hours one night. It was a Saturday, so my parents were going on a big date they had been planning for a few weeks, and my older sister was hanging out with her friends. I always liked being in the house by myself, because it meant I could eat on the couch and watch whatever I wanted to on the TV. I microwaved some leftover spaghetti and settled in for a luxurious YouTube binge. After about an hour, the doorbell rang. It was quite unusual for anyone to ring the doorbell at all, let alone at night. I was understandably startled, but I wasn't scared. I had no intention of opening the door to anyone while I was a kid on my own. However, I still felt the need to get up to see who was at the door. So I crept up quietly to make sure they didn't hear my footsteps. Then I looked through the peephole. To my relief, but also to some confusion, there was nobody there. No cars were parked on the curb in front of the house either. I shrugged it off as some kids who were probably even younger than me playing ding-dong ditch. Then I walked away and took my empty bowl of spaghetti from the living room to wash it out in the sink, as my mom specifically told me not to leave any dirty dishes. Afterwards, I went to the bathroom, then I sat back down on the couch and I resumed the video I was watching. I was concerned for a minute, but before long, I settled back down with some blankets and a soda from the fridge. Unfortunately, just a few minutes later, somebody was back at the door. This time they were knocking, but not just knocking normally. They were banging on the door like the police. I jumped up out of my skin and I stared at the door, just watching the door as the whole thing shook with every strike. I could feel the force of it through the ground and all the way up through the couch into my chest. Or maybe it was just because my heart was pounding so fast. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. I paused my video again and I let the deafening silence fill the room. Shaking like a leaf, I got up and shuffled my feet to the door. I looked through the peephole again, and nobody was there again. This time, however, it didn't calm my nerves at all. The only thing that helped me stop feeling terrified was getting mad. I suddenly wanted to step outside and yell into the front yard like a mean, crazy old man, cursing kids off of his property. Despite the urge, I never opened the door because I knew that wouldn't be very smart. I backed away in fear and I huddled underneath all the blankets on the couch, waiting to feel safe again. Finally, after about 10 minutes, I felt comfortable enough to press play on the TV once again. I was still super on edge after the whole thing though. A little bit later on, I heard what sounded like fireworks not far off in the distance, and I jumped so hard that I jammed my toe on the coffee table. I swore like a sailor because I knew nobody would get mad at me for using bad language, and during that time, I heard a couple more explosions go off. The 4th of July was like a month ago, but there are always certain people that keep launching them off every day at random until they finally run out, and there have always been some of those people in my neighborhood. I grumbled about stupid rednecks, and I ignored the sounds. But then just a minute or two later, chills ran down my spine as my torment continued. Somebody started pounding on the front door and repeatedly ringing the doorbell. Even worse, they were yelling as well. It sounded like a woman, and unlike before, it didn't stop after a few seconds. They just kept going like they were determined to not stop until they got an answer. I didn't even want to move. But my curiosity and frustration got the best of me, and I forced myself to investigate. As quietly as possible, I went up to the door and looked outside. Incredibly, there was somebody at the door this time, and I recognized them. They were my next-door neighbor, the wife of the newlyweds who had just moved in a few months ago to start a family. She was screaming, distraught, and begging for help and sobbing. I almost unlocked the door and let her in, but I immediately thought better of it when I took a closer look. Her face was smeared with blood, like she had been in some kind of car accident. The sight of blood triggered something within me, an intense selfish fear that I have never felt before or since. Even this woman clearly needed help. My instinct towards self-preservation would simply not allow me to open the door for her. If she needed somebody to help her, she would have to try the next door down, because it wouldn't be me. I wasn't going to take that risk. Even as her screaming continued, I slowly backed away and snuck upstairs to hide in my bedroom. I hid under the covers of my bed until she finally gave up, and at last, things were quiet again. A minute later, I heard what I thought were those rednecks firing off even more fireworks, so to block out the noise, I put on my headphones and played some loud music. But it wasn't long before I was disturbed yet again. Except this time, it wasn't by the noise. It was by light. The unmistakable flashing of red and blue cop lights shined in through my window, and when I looked outside, I saw that my house and both of my neighbors' houses, on either side, had been swarmed by the police. Ambulances were outside too, waiting to take the injured away, but unfortunately, as I later found out, there were no injured. The cops knocked on the door, and this time, I finally opened it. They asked me a bunch of questions, but they didn't answer any of mine. It wasn't until the story came out on the news that I found out what really happened. Some insane psycho was playing ding-dong ditch at people's houses in the neighborhood as a ploy to get them to open their doors. At which point, his plan was to jump out from around the corner and shoot them. After I refused to open up, he moved on to them, and unfortunately, the husband fell for it. When the killer heard the screams of his wife, he threatened her at gunpoint to go over to the last house he was at and begged them to open the door. It still didn't work on me, but it did work on my other neighbors, an elderly couple. After he tricked them with that poor woman, he shot all of them, and none of them survived. I narrowly avoided becoming part of the death toll simply by adhering to that rule I used to think was so obvious that it was so stupid to say. But apparently, it bears repeating forever. Don't answer the door for anyone. Not when you're alone, especially not in the middle of the night.